Evening, we're back again for our next round of Scottish Gin. I hope you're all keeping well and safe.
Yeah, this is number 4 of our round of Scottish Gin, so we're actually getting into the swing of things now. Way less nervous than we were a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, thanks to those of you that have joined us. This evening we are joined by Tony from the Borders Distillery, makers of William Kerr's Borders Gin. I'm sure you'll have seen our promo image of the bottle by now. It's a beautiful bottle, so we're excited to learn a little bit more about, you know, the brand, the contents, the distillery. It really was a memorable visit actually to the distillery. We went last year.
Fantastic distillery, isn't it?
Absolutely beautiful. So we know a little bit, but we thought we would just bring some of that to you guys that might not know. So we'll bring Tony in.
Good evening.
Hello.
Hi Tony, how's it going?
Good, thanks, apart from not being allowed out of my house, but we're all in the same boat.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's taken some getting used to, for sure.
Yeah. I'm sure you've got a plentiful supply of William Kerr's Borders gins, though.
I do, yes. I've got quite a few cases stacked up behind me, actually, of various whiskies, vodkas and gins. So from that point of view, we're in good hands.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. That's good.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much for taking the time to have a chat tonight.
Thank you for the invite.
I'm sure this isn't how you would normally spend a Friday night, us either. But this is the new, this is kind of quickly becoming the new normal. Yeah, I'm sure you've had plenty of online meetings by now. So, but no, so I guess just to kick things off, for those that don't know about, I guess it's the Three Stills company, isn't it? Is the brand umbrella kind of name, and the Borders Distillery. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. Well, the company name is, as you say, the Three Stills Company, and the Three Stills Company owns the Borders Distillery, and that is our main production vehicle. The distillery is located in Hawick in the Scottish Borders, about halfway between Edinburgh and Newcastle for those that are not very good at geography. And we've been now distilling for just slightly over 2 years now. The company's existed for about 7 years, but it took us a while to raise the money. It's quite a lot of money needed to build a distillery, and this building was a shell when we bought it and took it over. So it wasn't like we were buying an existing distillery. We were buying a shell of a building that needed converting into a distillery. So it was quite a lot of money that needed to be raised. It took us about 2.5, 3 years to raise that money. Once we had got it, we bought the site, and very quickly the work progressed. It took about 1.5 years to convert the old building into a brand new distillery, but it's not a brand new building. The main part of the building where we've housed the distillery was actually built in 1888. And then the second part of the building where we housed the shop and the visitor centre and the offices were added on in 1903. So it's quite an old building. And once we were sort of clearing all the horrible parts away that you have to do when a building's been empty for a number of years, it became obvious that there was some stunning aspects to the architecture, and they had a thing that was called random rubble that was quite common in parts of Scotland at that time. And when you blast off all the plaster that was caked on the walls, you could see this beautiful stonework, and it actually in the end saved us a lot of money, because when you saw that stonework you didn't want to put anything over it, and we'd had plans to kind of replaster and all the rest of it. But when we saw this beautiful random rubble stone work in a lot of parts of the distillery and in some of the meeting rooms, we've left that completely open, because it just adds, you can see what was built 130, 40 years ago, and it just adds so much character to the building.
Absolutely.
So yes, that sort of part of it was. I suppose when we went to build the distillery, there were two key objectives for that building. One was to preserve the integrity of that original architecture, and as much of the building as possible, and renovate and restore. And as you may have seen, we've won a lot of awards for the architectural aspect. The second part was, or the second objective was, to install a distillery into it that was as economical and environmentally efficient as possible. and we have very little movement of the various aspects of the distilling process. So it's a very efficient model, which is all quite incredible when you think that's been built into an old Victorian building.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something we're very proud of, and it's for a single malt whiskey distillery, which it is predominantly. We'll come on to that a bit later, I guess, but it's very unusual in its appearance because it doesn't have the traditional pergola, and so it looks a little bit different to distilleries that you'd see up in the Highlands. But once you're inside, you certainly get the feel of it feels like a distillery that's been around for a while, because of that feeling when you're inside the building.
Yeah. And I guess it's great you managed to rescue and sort of renovate an old building that was probably sitting derelict for a number of years, and rather than it just going to rack and ruin, you've managed to give it a new lease of life, and I guess bring employment to the area and sort of bring whiskey back to the area as well.
Yeah, and we were looking at a number of buildings in Hawick, because obviously there used to be a very buoyant town with the Tweed and the cashmere business, but some of that production had moved out to the Far East during the 70s and 80s, and so the town was going through a bit more of a sort of downwards sort of swing rather than the buoyancy of the cashmere period. Yeah. So there were quite a number of building options, but in the end we sort of plumped for this one because it was more central, and as you say, it's brought some employment, but it's not a huge amount of employment, because a distillery doesn't need that many people to run it, but I think what the most important aspect of it for the town is what it brings in terms of tourism, and hopefully for us, visitors from around the world, from our distributors and what have you, and that brings in extra hotel stays, more people in restaurants, more people in the bars, and that all brings extra income into the town. So hopefully it will be part of what will be a future success story for Hawick.
Brilliant.
Yeah, well, having experienced it firsthand, you've done a beautiful job. The restoration's amazing, but it's maintained that integrity, and hats off to you. We would definitely recommend a visit for anyone who hasn't been. Yeah, it's beautiful, and the tour and everything was fascinating. So yeah.
And what's the status of the distillery right now, Tony? And sort of how's the current situation affected your staff? And
yeah, we as soon as the announcement was first made, we had lots of telephone calls about what we would need to do, and at first we thought we were going to have to close. There was a lot of ambiguity, as I'm sure a lot of people will have had in their own businesses, and what you first thought were going to be the rules, then you realised actually that there was a little bit of flexibility, and we thought we would have to close, but then it became obvious that as long as within the distillery we can maintain very strictly the 2 metre rule, then we can carry on producing, and we have got very strict demarcation zones, if you like, within the distillery to make sure that the guys and girls that are working there are not breaking the rules. So we've managed to keep production going. We've furloughed 3 employees, but we did that because they fell into groups that were more vulnerable, 1 for age and 2 for underlying health problems, so we didn't want to put them at any further risk, so they've been furloughed on the basis that they fall into a different category, and with the rest of the staff we've been able to keep production going during the period. But even during that period, it as you would have seen in Scotland, some political movements to why were distilleries still open. There was one particular MP that was very anti, but eventually the sort of the guidelines were made very clear, and we were falling well within that, so we've been able to stay open, which is fortunate. But we have, like everybody, we've had to close the visitor centre and the distillery shop, so that's unfortunate, but there isn't any retail apart from supermarkets and pharmacies at the moment anyway, so
yeah. And obviously, for those that don't know, I mean, we know what you do there, but it's a commercial kind of role. What does that look like? What does that involve?
My own role.
Yes, your own role. Yeah.
Sorry. There were originally 4 founders to the business. Very sadly, one of those partners passed away a couple of years ago. That leaves 3 remaining founders. We split the responsibilities. John has more of an operational role, and he's based near the distillery. Tim is more responsible for investor relations and all the marketing and the creation of the beautiful Kerrs bottle and packaging. And my role is the commercial side, which is to build particularly the international markets for the various brands that we sell. So I spend a lot of time abroad, a lot of time on an aeroplane. Hence, I live down south and sort of fairly close to Heathrow and Gatwick, because that's where I seem to spend half my life. So it's basically going around to different markets. We've actually opened up 35 markets around the world, and we've been particularly successful in Asia and the Middle East and across Europe. So going out to markets like Malaysia and Thailand and Singapore and Taiwan, not China for the moment, and in the Middle East we've been very successful in Oman, Lebanon, Jordan, to name a few, and working with a third-party distributor in those markets. So the distributor has a sales and marketing team. We put together a plan for William Kerrs, for example, and it's amazing when you go around to other markets. And the first one I really saw this in was Malaysia, where they're starting to see the early signs of what we've had for 5 or 10 years at least, where there are even gin bars opening up in Kuala Lumpur.
Wow.
And they're doing it really well. They're obviously people that have travelled to Europe, seen what's been done in Spain and what's been done in the UK, replicating that in Kuala Lumpur, and being very impressed by the sort of theatre that they're bringing to the gin and tonic serve, if you like, in a bar. I went to one bar in Kuala Lumpur where it's probably the most theatre I've seen in a gin and tonic anywhere in the world. So they sit you in this sort of very luxurious settee, and you kind of almost want to fall asleep. They bring you along the gin and tonic, and they had probably 300 different gins behind the bar. And then you get wheeled this trolley that's a bit like the old-fashioned cheese trolley, or the old after-dinner drinks trolley. But on it, it's just like loads of different, what would you think were condiments, but they're all different things like juniper berries, and you just pick a few to sort of do the garnish for your gin and tonic. And you have somebody with, beautifully, immaculately dressed, serving these things into your gin and tonic, and then they wheel the trolley off and you sit there, and it's the most amazing experience. And that's in a market like Malaysia. So it's just showing that in other parts of the world, it's interesting that they're a long way behind the curve in terms of UK and Spain in particular, but really that whole gin and tonic thing is starting to gather a lot of momentum in countries that you'd have seen very little gin sales, 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah. And so do you find that your gin, I guess you've got a range of products, but does your gin does particularly well, does it? I mean, you've got a vodka, you've got the whiskies, you said. I mean, how does that fare? Do you find? It
varies market to market, and I guess a lot depends on what excites the distributor. We do whiskies, and our single malt whiskey's not ready yet, but we do have a blended Scotch and a blended malt. And in certain parts of the world, they're probably our lead product in that's what opens the door to a distributor, because they want a Scotch whiskey. And there are so many gins out there, particularly in the UK. Even countries like Germany now are producing so many different gins that you go and talk to any distributor in any market, and they've got 5 or 6 gins on their list. They don't really need any more. So it's kind of leading with the whiskey, and then when you've got that relationship, you can then talk about other products in more cluttered categories like gin. Here's our William Kerrs. Once they've been to the distillery and they've seen the whole process, they tend to fall more in love with the story and the process, and then it's an easier sell. But There are a few markets where we've led with the gin. So we opened up with a really good distributor in Denmark, and all he wanted was the gin until the vodka came along, and now he wants the vodka. But he's not interested in the whiskies. He just wants the gin because he was so fascinated with the production process that it was so different to other gins that's what he wanted, and that was his motivation. So it does vary, but I would say internationally we haven't had the sort of uptake that I was hoping for, but what we do see is an acceptance, because it's an unusual taste profile, our gin, compared to many of the gins out there. And we see a much greater acceptance level of that in mainland Europe, where there is more of a culture of unusual flavours of white spirits, particularly in Eastern Europe, where they tend to have rakias and various kind of strong white spirits that they've made at home, and they're kind of they're used to unusual flavours, and they kind of appreciate the differences of certain complexities of white spirit that you can get. So we get a very high acceptance level to the taste, whereas in the UK, when we do tastings, because it's such a different style to a number of the gins, where you get that really kind of in-your-face, the botanicals and that floral nose, and ours is more subtle. We sometimes get a sort of mixture where people either love it. It's very much a Marmite gin. People either love it or they hate it. I shouldn't be saying that when I'm talking about my brand, but that's the truth of the matter. But we don't get that so much in Europe. In Europe, we very rarely get anyone saying, well, that's a bit unusual, I don't like that. They normally just go, oh, this is nice, where can I buy it? So it's a completely different reaction.
Yeah, it's exactly what we're told in Tour as well, was it? That it's one of those gins, you'll either love it or it's perhaps not for you. And I guess that's a great thing about gin. There's a gin out there for everyone, and you've sometimes just got to spend a bit of time sort of exploring and looking for the gin that's right for you, you know. But obviously, I mean, it's William Kerr's Borders gin. So can you tell us a bit more about William Kerr himself and sort of how his story influenced the gin that you've created?
Absolutely, yeah. When we from the very start of the project, we knew we wanted to make a gin in a slightly unusual way. What we didn't have was a brand story or a brand name. And Tim, one of the other co-founders, started to do some research, and he picked up the phone one day, kind of quite excited. He said, "You're never going to believe this. I've been doing lots of research." He'd gone to the library in Hawick and done a lot of research. He said, "There's a guy called William Kerr, and he was born in Hawick in, I think it's 1779, I think was the year. And he was a botanist. He was a plant collector, and he was procured by Kew Gardens down in southwest London. And then, so he went to work for a Kew, and then he was sent out to Asia. You imagine in the late 1700s being sent on a ship out to Mongolia, the Philippines, China, and his job was to collect plants and bring them back to the UK. And I can't imagine, I haven't done the research, but I imagine it's probably I would think you'd been at sea for 2 or 3 months to get out there. So the task of bringing back plants and keeping them alive on a 2 or 3 month sailing journey and bring them back to Kew. But if you go to Kew Gardens, there are 238, I think it is, plants that have Kerr's name on the plaque that he brought back to these islands from Mongolia, China. He was the guy. He was the Western guy who discovered the tiger lily in China. So when we saw this story, and then he was so successful with that, he was sent off to what was Ceylon at the time, is now Sri Lanka, to help them with their botanical gardens. And we felt that, you've got a guy born in your hometown. His surname is Kerr, it's a strong sounding name, but it's a very traditional Scottish family name. And he's a plant collector, botanist. He travelled around the world. It has to be his name. It's got to be. So it was one of those moments where you kind of just thankful for history that it just fell into place that this guy was born in our town and had a brilliant Scottish surname, and nobody else had it registered. So we were able to get the brand name registered and start building the story around that.
Brilliant. No, great story. And I suppose you touched on it earlier there that the taste isn't necessarily it's different, I guess. So how would you, if you're to really describe that flavour profile, how would you go about it, and how might you serve it at home?
Yeah. Well, firstly, the reason it's different is that we make our gin from a barley-based spirit, not from grain-neutral spirit. I would say probably 99% of gins in the UK, perhaps even more than that, are made from grain-neutral spirit, which is vodka, effectively, and then you add the botanicals in various different ways. We make all our spirit from barley grown in the Borders, within 20 miles of our distillery. The barley's brought in, we distill spirit. All of that spirit could become single malt whiskey if we chose to, by putting it into cask and aging it for 3 years and a day. But at that point, we choose to take some of that finished spirit, and instead of putting it into cask, we take it to our carter head still, which was specially designed for us, and was put in at the start when we built the distillery. We then put that spirit through the carter head still, and it's fired up, taken up to 96.2% alcohol. When it comes out again, we then put it through another time through the carter head still, but this time we suspend a basket of botanicals in the neck of the still. So it's the vapours that pass through the botanicals. We don't immerse the botanicals in the spirit. And that gives us a much more subtle, firstly it's a more complex way of producing the gin, and it's a more expensive way of producing the gin, and there's a lot more things that can go wrong. So we actually tend to have a person actually visibly there watching the distillation process, which you don't do while you're making the whiskey, because so many things can go wrong. So it's a process that has to be carefully monitored. And then after the vapours pass through the botanicals and they draw off all the essential oils from the botanicals, and then the liquids condense back down, and we have our William Kerr's gin. Yeah. So because you're starting with that barley spirit, you make spirit made from malted barley, the mouthfeel is very different. It's a much creamier texture is the best way I can describe it. It's obviously not creamy, but that's the way most people, when you say it, they go, oh yeah, I get that. It's kind of got a slightly different mouthfeel to other gins, and it's maybe a little bit more viscous is probably another way of explaining it. And obviously on the nose you get a hint of that barley coming through, but you get different people get different things. I've had people tell me they can't smell juniper, and then I've had some journalists describe it as juniper heavy. So what I always tell people when we're doing tastings is that there is no right or wrong answer to whether you're doing wine tasting, whiskey tasting, or gin tasting, or whatever it is, because we're all different. Absolutely. We all smell different things, we all taste different things, and there is no right or wrong answer. So all you can do is say, look, what I'm smelling is this, and that might prompt someone to say, yeah, that was what I was looking for. But somebody else might say, well, actually, and I get this a lot on the nose, because the way we make it, the botanicals are much more subtle. That allows them to compete in the glass. So what you get, it's a little bit like fine wine. If I've got my gin here, but if I go and smell it and then I leave it for 5 minutes and smell it again, I get different smells. Yeah. So sometimes I will get a real citrus. So we've got 3 of the botanicals we use are lemon peel, sweet orange peel, and bitter orange peel. So there should be quite heavy citrus undertones, and quite often you get the citrus. But then I've had people go, I can't smell citrus, but I really get the licorice. And then other people go, oh, that's coriander, I get coriander. Now all of those are in there, but they're all subtle, and they're allowed to compete, and you can get those different smells. And I think for me the beauty of Kerr's is that you do get those different smells and flavours at different times, and it's not kind of that real in your face sort of blast of botanicals. But it, as I've said, it's a gin that I think requires a certain taste profile, if you like. You in the UK, you're definitely either going to think, yeah, that's a gin for me, or that's not one for me. So it's not. I understand it's not for everybody's taste.
It's funny though, Tony, as a Scotsman, I'm a non-whiskey drinker, which is almost sacrilege. But certainly when I tried your gin, I got the sort of malty barley notes, almost a slight whiskey undertone. And I've always, whenever anybody's asked me about your gin, I've always said, if you're a whiskey drinker who hasn't got into gin yet, it's a fantastic gin to take you into the gin category, just because of that slight whiskey note, but it's still got the classic sort of gin flavour profile as well,
Yeah, and because of the heaviness of the barley and that's what gives it that mouthfeel. going back to your question, the one that we recommend most of all is the Fever Tree Mediterranean, because it's. I find that the really bitter quinine tonics clash a little bit with the barley, but something that's a little bit softer and a little bit sweeter, like the Mediterranean. But the one that really, it's a limited edition, I believe. Sure, yes, it's somewhere on their limited edition, but it's the Clementine one that they're doing at the moment, because of the citrus element to it. This just seems to work really. That's what I'm actually drinking with it at the moment.
Nice.
And that to me works even better than the Mediterranean, but I don't know how long they're going to do that Clementine one for, but it works extremely well with the Kerrs. So we generally say one part. Usually for me, it's a 50ml measure and 3 parts of tonic, and then we recommend a wheel of orange. Not particularly well cut by me on this occasion, but that's what I think. I think orange in a gin and tonic looks more attractive than lemon, just visually, and we drink a lot we drink and eat with our eyes quite a lot, and I think the visual appeal of a drink is very important. And the orange just works extremely well with that citrus element to it on the nose, so that's what we would recommend. But because of the lockdown, I've got 3 adult children, so I've got to keep them amused at some point. But we've been doing a lot of cocktail experiments, and we've come up with some interesting cocktails. But we've got a favourite called a Kerr Berry, but it can actually be used with any gin, because by the time you're finished, you can't actually get the gin characteristic. It's just alcohol. But that's been one of the areas that we've sort of kept the entertainment levels up in the house. But then on the counter side of that, you realise that you've actually got to get out and do some running or something to counter all the excess pounds that you've been piling on.
Too true. Too true.
And obviously, you've talked to us about your William Kerrs as well. So can you tell us a wee bit about the other products that are made at the distillery and sort of what your plans are for your single malt?
Yeah. So the backbone of the whole project was to be a single malt whisky distillery, and to launch the first single malt whisky that produced in the Scottish Borders for over 180 years. So there were a lot of distilleries in the Borders back in the day. But those nasty English people created a thing called excise duty. They used to send the excise man up on horseback to collect the excise, and at that point there were a lot of distilleries in the Borders. And they didn't like paying excise. They'd never had to pay it before. They certainly didn't like paying excise to an Englishman on a horseback. So one by one, those distilleries were closing down, because in those days the kit was more mobile, and they'd stick it on a cart, get the horse, and they would move off and move into the Highlands and the islands to become more inaccessible, and the horseback rider wasn't going any further into Scotland than he needed to in those days. It was too dangerous to be carrying satchels of money. So in 1837, the very last distillery closed in Kelso. And actually in Kelso, if you go into the town, there's actually a little lane called Distillery Lane. And in great British tradition, there's actually a supermarket at the end of it now, rather than a distillery. But that was the last distillery in the Scottish Borders, and it closed in 1837. So we were bringing distilling back to the Borders after 180 years, and single malt whisky was the backbone of that. So we're now 2 years roughly into the aging of the spirit. I can't call it whisky yet, because I've got more or less another year and a day before we can legally call it single malt whisky. But in terms of when that's going to be launched, it will come down to purely when it's ready. And we've been lucky that our investors have basically said to the 3 founders that with your whisky backgrounds and expertise, we will leave it to you. You decide when you think that whisky is ready, but we don't want to release it because we need more revenue, and it's not ready. We will wait until we totally believe that the liquid is mature enough to release as a single malt whisky. Because there have been quite a few new distilleries in Scotland over the last 5 or 6 years, and 1 or 2 have released their whiskies a little bit too early, and they will admit it privately. I won't say the names of them, but they run under revenue pressure, and you can see why they release it. But if we can avoid that, then we'd like to hold on and wait till the whiskey's really mature enough.
Yeah.
So obviously waiting for that process is a very expensive process. Making spirit on a daily and weekly basis sucks a lot of money out of the business. So to raise revenue in the early stages, we created a blended Scotch called Clan Fraser. And that's been probably our lead product internationally, but we've had that for the longest now. It's probably been around 5 years now. And then we created a blended malt called Lower East Side. And the name Lower East Side is a play on the location of our distillery, which is in the southeast corner of Scotland. But if you were in Manhattan, they would call that the Lower East Side of Scotland. And we wanted to give it a name that had that kind of cool Americana imagery around it, but it's got all the provenance and heritage of being a 100% malt whisky from Scotland. At the moment, none of the liquid in there is from our distillery, but as it becomes mature, we will start to put a little bit more and more in, and as it gets older, the age profile gets older, we'll put a lot more of our spirit into there. So eventually, Lower East Side will have a large chunk of our whisky in there, but not exclusively because it is a blended malt. Nice. And then the gin came next, and then the most recent product, which a little bit of bad luck along the way, we launched our vodka right at just a week or two before the shutdown. So we'll probably have to launch it again and go through that whole process once things are a bit more relaxed. But it's made in the same way as the gin. We take that finished barley new make spirit, we put it through the Carter head still and take it up to 96.2, and we put it through again, but instead of the botanicals in the basket this time, we put charcoal. And the charcoal, as you probably know, is an incredibly absorbent thing, and it just sucks everything out, and it takes out all the nastiness that you don't want in your spirit, and you're left with this incredibly smooth vodka. And it's got, again, the characteristic of the gin in that mouthfeel. The first thing everybody says when they taste it is, wow, that's a really creamy mouthfeel, is the expression we get told all the time. And it's so smooth. When you swallow it, there is absolutely no burn at all. It's a really smooth vodka. And that now been probably just over a month and a half that we launched that. And that's called Puffing Billy. And the name Puffing Billy came about because the Carter head still is a strange looking contraption, and one day we had a visitor from England, and they were going around on one of the tours, and they advised the person that was taking the tour, they'd just been down in London to one of the museums, and they'd seen the Puffing Billy steam train, which is the oldest steam train that still exists in the UK, and it's in a museum in London. And he said, your still looks exactly like the old Puffing Billy steam train. The story got passed on through to us, and we said, I don't know if you're aware, you probably are aware because you guys have been to distilleries all over, but there's a thing in the industry that you name stills. Stills have all got names. They generally are ladies' names rather than men's names, but not always, it's not exclusive, but generally they are. And we just said, look, that sounds like a cool name, we'll just call it Puffing Billy. And so we named the still Puffing Billy. And then when we were creating the vodka, because it's what we're calling a steam vodka, because again, it's the vapour that passes through the charcoal, we came up with the expression steam vodka. And somebody said, well, if it's steam vodka and it's a bit like a steam train, let's call it Puffing Billy. So that's how the name came about. So those are our four main, well, they are the four main products with the single malt still to come. So that will be at some point, I would imagine, over the next 2 or 3 years.
Brilliant, yeah. And how would I mean, you've just, like you mentioned there, the vodka is quite new out. But how, in terms of your entire range, how should people get hold of your gin right now?
The gin you can get online through Master of Malt, Amazon. We also have our own online distillery shop at the bordersdistillery.com, and you just click on the tile that says shop. And at the moment, during the lockdown, we've wiped out the delivery charge, so you are just paying the retail price, and it's free delivery. And I think it's normally $4.95 or $5.95, so it's proportionally quite a saving. But we were hoping that that might prompt a few more people to shop online, because that seems to be the way to buy your drinks these days. That with a lot of the off licenses being shut most of the time. But so yes, it can be bought online. There are other retailers, but those are probably the three main ones.
Yeah. And can you tell us a bit more about the creative process behind your bottle and the branding for the William Kerr's gin as well?
Yeah, as I said a little time ago, that we came up with the name and the story. Once you have that, particularly for creative people, which I'm not one, but that's what they tell me, is once you've got the story and a brand name, you can then start to visualise the way that it might look. But it's quite interesting. I was having a look earlier on at the early bottles and the early labels, and where you get to in the journey, you forget where you started off, because we're now so used to this bottle and label, you forget how it looked at its kind of first or second iteration. Yeah. And it's just a process you go through. So Tim, who did all the hard work on this, would work with a design agency, a marketing agency, and sort of it's down to the quality of your brief to their designer. They'll come up with various bottle shapes. You're also looking at your competitive set, so you might target 3 or 4 brands that you think the packaging on those is really where we want to be, but they're all different, so you throw those in and you sort of put yours alongside. And I don't mind naming some because I think their bottles are stunning, but Isle of Harris obviously would be one that you'd look at and go, well, that's a nice looking bottle. Yeah. There's a brand down on the Isle of Wight called Mermaid Gin, beautiful bottle. But it's not just about the bottles. You're looking at various things, so you'll put a number of competitive brands in there and start to pick off things that you like, and then the creative people get to work. They come back with and you start off with the bottle shape, and then the work starts on the label, start bringing the two together, and then it really comes down to the detail, because fairly quickly we got to the rough bottle shape that we have today, and the label design to a degree with that sort of floral feel to the cut of the label, and then it just comes down to finessing various details. So putting on, so we wanted our own bottle, and it has embossed onto the bottle the Borders Distillery and distilled in Hoik, and various other details that you want added, and then it becomes just a process. You can, if you've got the money, you'll go into research and you'll ask consumers or possibly the bar trade what they think of the design versus another design, and try and get a steer. But ultimately, unless you're going to spend millions of pounds on that, you're only going to get a few people's opinion, and sometimes that can be very misleading. And even companies as big as Diageo have spent millions on research, thought they had the answer, and within 3 months they pulled a product because it didn't work, didn't do what the research told them it would do. So it's not a surefire way of being told that what you're doing is the right thing to do. So we tended to use family and friends, and say, what do you think of this one versus this one, and kind of, if that matched what we were feeling, then you kind of felt a bit more confident that you weren't. So what you don't want to do is make all the decisions because you become too close to something that you can sometimes not see something that's blatantly wrong for everybody else, but you've just become blinkered because you've been working with that design for a few weeks, and it's kind of in your head that that's the right design. So it's important to listen to other inputs, but not be necessarily kind of kiboshed by somebody who has a sudden dramatic opinion and wants to take it off on a tangent.
I think you did the right thing, and I think you guys are you're so invested. Literally, you as founders, you've done everything right. You've researched the area, the way that you've branded the bottle, but it's absolutely stunning, and I would say it's very in keeping with the distillery and with the brand. Quite traditional, and I think we think it's absolutely beautiful. And like you say, the wee details on the bottle.
I love the compass in the background behind the text as well. It's subtle, but it's really nice, and obviously ties into.
And also, one of the things we were keen to do, because so many consumers want to know the information, is you'll see. Sort of, it's in small print, and I need glasses to read them these days. But we've listed the botanicals around the label, so not all 11 are there, but I think there's 8 or 9 of them are listed, and we've had lots of positive feedback from consumers that's a good thing, because they're always wanting to know what are the botanicals in the gin.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, no, that's been really insightful. Thank you very much for chatting to us. I guess on a more personal note, whether it be for yourself or the business, you know, what are you, when all this is over, what are you most looking forward to?
All sorts of things. I'm a massive football fan, so that's probably been the hardest thing for me. Is when it all started, you thought, well, at least I can sit and watch some football, but then that was taken away. I'm about 2 years ago, I qualified as a UEFA B level coach, and I am the assistant manager at a semi-professional team down in the south, and we took over at a team that was struggling, and we only got 3 games in charge before the league was suspended, and so we were sort of taking on a new set of players and started to get to know them. So I would say the biggest thing I've missed is football, and that's what I'm looking forward to, because you miss match days, the banter in the changing room, and all that sort of stuff is. When we all miss it when you're not getting that interaction with your family and your friends, but I've certainly missed that, and I've missed the football. But apart from that, I think just like everybody, it'd be nice to. I was WhatsApping one group of friends saying, which pub are we going to go to in this all? I'm just going to go and just get silly for a few hours, and it's all things that you just took for granted. You don't realise, how lucky we are with the freedom we had, and we all took it for granted for so long, and suddenly it's taken away from you, and you're sort of craving for it now. So those would probably be the 2. Football definitely, followed by a few days down the pub with a few different groups of mates.
Yeah, sounds like a good plan. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I think that's probably everything that we wanted to ask, and hopefully those that are watching or will watch in the coming days and weeks have got what they needed to learn about the Borders Distillery and William Kerr's. And we just second what we said before: fantastic distillery, amazing tour, and great products. So keep up the good work when things get back to normal, certainly anyway. Good luck with lockdown, and I guess we'll see you on the other side.
On the other side, yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Tony.
Stay safe.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Bye. Bye.
Okay, thanks everyone. That concludes our 4th round of Scottish Gin. Thanks again to Tony for joining us. We really enjoyed that, and have a good weekend. I guess our next round of Scottish Gin is not with the gin maker next time. It's with Kirsten Spears of KD Media. They run the Scottish Gin Awards along with a variety of other awards programmes. So we thought that would be a bit of a change of pace. So looking forward to learning a bit more about the Scottish Gin Awards, how that all works, and so we'll chat to Kirsten on Monday. I hope you can join us 8 o'clock, same time. So
until then, stay safe, and thanks for watching as always.
Take care. Have a nice weekend.
Cheers.
Bye.